Good afternoon. I'm Mackenzie Glenzadrali, Senior Enrichment Program Director with the Wisconsin Alumni Association. On behalf of our organization, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to our Wisconsin Ideas Spotlight program, Understanding North Korea with David Fields. Before we begin our program, please acknowledge with me that the Wisconsin Alumni Association and UW-Madison are situated upon traditional territories. The Wisconsin Alumni Association respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. During our program today, we welcome your comments and questions. Please use the chat feature on YouTube to ask your questions, and we will do our best to get to them during the question and answer portion of the program. Our speaker today is David Fields, UW historian and Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies at UW-Madison. Fields is a leading expert in U.S. Korean relations, U.S. East Asian relations, and American foreign policy. He is the author of Foreign Friends, Syngman Rhee, American Exceptionalism and the Division of North Korea, and the editor of the Diary of Syngman Rhee, 1904 to 34, 1944, published by the National Museum of Korean Contemporary History. Since 2015, he has been the book review editor of the Journal of American East Asian Relations. He has been published in the Washington Post, the North Korean Review, the Journal of American East Asian Relations, sinonk.com, Transactions of the Royal Asiatic Society Korea Branch, and the Working Papers series of the Cold War International History Project. His research and analysis has been featured on National Public Radio, Wisconsin Public Radio, C-SPAN, and CNN. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much, Mackenzie.
And finally, our moderator for today's program is Todd Pritchard, Director of Media and Public Relations for the Wisconsin Foundation and Alumni Association. Before joining the Wisconsin Foundation and Alumni Association, Todd worked as a reporter, producer, and news director at TV stations across the country, including Madison, Minneapolis, Seattle, and Honolulu. He also worked as a public information officer for the Wisconsin Emergency Management and was honored at the White House as a champion of change. Welcome, Todd.
Thank you so much, Mackenzie.
Well, thank you to both of you for being here today with us. I'm really excited to learn more about North Korea. Todd, may I turn it over to you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mackenzie. And David, thank you for being here. It's such an honor to have you part of this program. North Korea has always fascinated me. I know it's fascinated many of our viewers. The confusing part, I guess, is that we get these little snippets of information. We get, maybe a 30-second or a 1-minute news story about a missile launch or, something going on. But I'm really looking forward to your discussion today to really give us a depth of information that can help us kind of really, really understand this country and this regime.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Todd. And thank you for moderating this event. Thank you to Mackenzie and all the other staff at the Alumni Association for inviting me to speak on this very important topic. I'm really excited to be speaking to the Alumni Association because I don't just work at the University of Wisconsin. I'm also an alumnus of the University of Wisconsin. And I was also educated at the University of Wisconsin. And, as an 18-year-old growing up in rural Monroe County, Wisconsin, I don't even think I probably could have located Korea on a map. But that's the wonderful thing about having such a great comprehensive state university is that you can go there and kids from rural Wisconsin can grow up and can be educated and can follow their curiosity wherever it might take them, whether it's into the sciences or literature or into Korea. You just never know. And the university really gives such great options for education in our state. So I'm always happy not only to be employed here, but to really support the mission of the university however I can. So understanding North Korea, if I do my job right today, I'm hoping that the next time our audience sees one of these, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, or maybe one of the really long 90-second stories on North Korea, they will have a little bit more context for the narrative and for how North Korea actually works as a society. So, as you mentioned, North Korea is a country that we encounter quite frequently, despite the fact that it's 6,000 miles away and virtually has no diplomatic trading, or cultural relations with the United States. We're all familiar with North Korea, and yet there's so much that we don't understand about it. And I'm speaking about myself here as well. I've been studying North Korea for the better part of a decade. I've even been able to visit North Korea. I've lived in South Korea for about 4 years. But there are still so many things I don't understand about North Korea. It is a very perplexing place. Of course, you could say the same thing about any country on earth, right? I mean, I am an American. I don't fully understand the United States. And I suspect that Canadians don't fully understand Canada. I suspect that the Japanese don't fully understand Japan. But as an American, I think I do understand how our society is ordered at a basic level, right? Our politics are governed by a flawed but robust democratic system. Our economy is governed by free markets with varying degrees of state regulation, depending on the sector. And this organizational structure has its flaws, to be sure. But when we look around the world, we see that many other societies, though not all, are organized around these same or similar principles. However, even people casually acquainted with North Korea know that North Korea does not work like this. And if you're my age or even a little bit older, you also know that regimes like North Korea used to be much more common than they are today. And that is regimes with centrally planned economies, authoritarian single party governments, often with a cult of personality at the top. However, most of these states collapsed or underwent fundamental changes in the 1980s and 1990s. And so, how has North Korea survived? I feel like that's a common question that I want to address today, and it's key to understanding North Korea. These other communist societies collapsed because the benefits that they promised proved to be insufficient to justify the levels of political control that they demanded. Most communist countries like China, Vietnam, or the Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, when they were faced with this crisis over communism, they had to evolve. And they have all become market-driven, development-driven, market-orientated states, even while they are still authoritarian. There's little doubt that North Korea has not evolved along those lines. And so, how should we understand North Korea? What kind of state is it, and why does it appear to be so stable? And why does it seem to be the only communist state that has survived? So in my talk today, there are many things that we could talk about in an attempt to understand North Korea. In the time we have today, I can only focus on two, and that is ideology and underdevelopment. So what is the North Korean ideology, and how does it function? And how does the Kim regime use underdevelopment as a means of control? And I want to warn you that I'm going to be spending much more time talking about ideology rather than underdevelopment, okay? The talk will mainly be about North Korean ideology. And my goal today is to give you a framework for understanding North Korea so that the next time you see North Korea in the news, you'll have a bit of context for understanding what you're seeing. So first, my first point about North Korean ideology is that it's hard to underestimate the importance of ideology in North Korea. North Koreans, like all people, including Americans, believe or they act in certain ways because of what they believe is true about themselves and the world around them. All right. Now, unfortunately, in the case of North Korea, there is a lack of understanding among casual observers as to what North Korean ideology is. So the first point I want to make is that North Korea is not communist. Despite what you will hear over and over again in the news, North Korea is not a communist country. Although North Korea was founded as a communist regime, it no longer holds to many or perhaps any of the basic social and economic tenets of communism. So how do we know this? I have four pieces of evidence to support this assertion. First, North Korea has a class system. From its very beginning, North Korean society was divided into a rigid and hereditary class structure according to one's Chulshin Sungbun, or citizen registration. And there are three classes in North Korea: the core class, the wavering class, and the hostile class. So the core class is the class at the top, and it is made up of high-ranking members of the Korean Workers' Party, the military, essential bureaucrats, and of course, members of the Kim family. Originally, the core class was constructed of those North Koreans who could claim to have played some sort of part in North Korea's struggle for independence against Japan in the early 20th century. But now I think this class can best be described as those North Koreans who are essential to the functioning of the North Korean state. The core class is at the top of society. At the bottom of society, you have the hostile class. And these would be the people whose ancestors were landowners, Christians, collaborators with the Japanese, or have something else in their family backgrounds that might have caused them to come under suspicion of the state. In between the two, you have the wavering class. And this would be your average North Koreans who do not fall into any of the other two categories. That is, they neither qualify for special protection or special privilege, nor for special repression. Now, for much of North Korean history, your status in this class system determined everything about you. It determined where and how much education you got. It determined your opportunities for advancement, where you lived, in many cases, who you married, and often even how much food you ate. Rising from one of these classes to another was very difficult, while falling out of the core class down into one of the lower classes was quite simple, and it was usually not just a demotion for you, but for your entire family. So from the beginning, this class system made North Korea an odd sort of communist country. Most communist countries, although they had classes, did not have such a formalized structure. So that's my first piece of evidence. The second is inequality. North Korea no longer even pretends to redistribute wealth or provide a basic living for the majority of its citizens, as you would expect a communist state to at least attempt to do. In fact, it has embraced inequality. For the first several decades, actually, North Korea did generally seem to be committed to a redistribution of wealth, and it successfully inverted what had been a highly unequal class structure of traditional Korea. However, as this communist system began to break down in the 1990s, the redistribution system in North Korea also ceased to function. And today, North Korea's public distribution system largely just confiscates production from the lower classes, the wavering and the hostile class, and redistributes it to the core class, the very opposite of what we would expect from a communist regime. So the third piece of evidence I have is that North Korea is ruled by a hereditary dynasty. You may have noticed that all the leaders of Korea have the same last name, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, and you probably know that, in fact, they are all related, grandfather, father, and son. This is an arrangement that is not justifiable by any communist doctrine, and it's unique to any state that has ever claimed to be communist. Fourth, and finally, North Koreans themselves have officially abandoned communism. In 2009, North Korea revised its constitution, dropping all references to communism and instead adding references to Sungun, or the military first policy. All right. So why does it matter? I've spent a lot of time here talking about why North Korea is not a communist society, but why does this matter? I think it's so important because communism provides what I believe is a false framework for understanding North Korea. Especially since the 1990s, communism now carries with it a certain inevitability. We know that communist regimes are unsustainable and that sooner or later they have to evolve, they have to liberalize, or they will collapse. And therefore, a lot of people believe it's only a matter of time before North Korea does one of those things. And so we are perplexed why North Korea has continued in much the way it has been, okay? And the truth is, I believe that North Korea has already undergone a transition from communism to a new ideology. But it's an ideology that's difficult to recognize. And so many who don't study North Korea in depth have missed it. All right, so it's not communist. Now, officially, the ideology of North Korea is what is called Juche, which means approximately self-reliance. But the tenets of Juche philosophy are so enormously difficult to understand and parse out that some scholars have suggested it's actually a sham ideology that was created for the sole purpose of giving Kim Il-sung his own ideology so he could argue that he was at the same level intellectually with Mao Zedong and Lenin and other communist leaders of the 20th century. I am not sure whether it's a sham ideology or not, but I think that studying Juche certainly has its limitations. I do not feel like I can explain it to you today, but I think there's a better way to understand North Korean ideology. And that is by explaining North Korean views of history, North Korean views of their leaders, and North Korean views of themselves, okay? So if I can get you to understand these three things, I think I can get you a long way towards understanding what the ideology of North Korea is. All right, so their views of history, their views of their leaders, and their views of themselves. So first of all, we'll talk about history. For North Koreans, history is victimization, and this victimization is empowering. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but just stay with me for a minute, okay? To be a victim in this sense is to be innocent, it is to be justified, and it is a category that makes one's actions justifiable, okay? And the way I see North Korean history and their views of history is it's divided up into three major periods of victimization, okay? So there's the Japanese colonization, the Korean War, and the Arduous March. And I'll go through each of these very, very briefly. So if you don't know, Japan colonized Korea from 1905 to 1945. The Japanese colonial regime in Korea killed thousands of Korean independence activists. It brutally suppressed one of the world's first nonviolent protests in the March 1st movement, and it impressed thousands or even tens of thousands of Korean women into sexual slavery in the 1930s. It also did everything it could to eliminate Koreans as a culture. It forced Koreans to take Japanese names. It forced them to worship at Japanese Shinto shrines, and it forced them to learn to speak Japanese and to only be educated in Japanese. And so you can imagine there's a lot of cultural resentment still from that experience. And this is true in South Korea today, as well as North Korea. But in North Korea, these feelings of resentment are actually cultivated, and they are encouraged to feel this resentment at what the Japanese did. So this is the first period of victimization. The second is the Korean War. Now, it may come as a surprise to some of you that North Koreans believe themselves to be the primary victims of the Korean War. But North Koreans are taught that it was the South Koreans and the United States that started the war, and then over the course of the 3 years of the war, resorted to all kinds of atrocities imaginable in an attempt to reduce North Korea to the status of an American colony, to essentially destroy North Korea as a society. These atrocities, alleged atrocities, included using germ warfare and the unrestricted bombing of North Korean civilians and civil infrastructure. Now, there is no credible evidence whatsoever that germ warfare or biological warfare was used in the Korean War by the United States or anyone else. But the indiscriminate bombing of North Korea during the war has been well documented. The United States dropped more bombs on North Korea during the Korean War than they dropped in the entire Pacific theater in World War II. And in the opinion of many Air Force analysts, the bombing of North Korea was more extensive and the destruction was worse than what was done to Japan in World War II, including the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, this bombing campaign is not well remembered in the United States today, but it is known by heart in North Korea. So given the immense destruction that Koreans suffered during the Korean War and the belief that they have, because they are taught that the Americans started it, you can see why they can believe that they are the chief victims of the war. So the final period of victimization is from the death of Kim Il-sung, the founder of the Kim dynasty, in 1994 to 1998. And it is referred to as the Arduous March, or the Gonanhaengun. During this period, the collapse of barter trade with the Soviet Union and decades of economic mismanagement caused extensive flooding in North Korea and created famine conditions for 4 years, which killed anywhere from 200,000 to 2 million North Koreans. The exact numbers will probably never be known. Actually, in North Korea's almost 80 years of history, there has never been a proper census of North Korea, so we don't even know exactly what the population of North Korea is. But the amount of people that starved to death in this famine was almost certainly in the hundreds of thousands. This was undoubtedly the darkest period in North Korean history. Now, unable to deal with the primarily internal causes of the famine, the Kim regime instead told its people that the famine was the result of an American blockade and an American plot to try to destroy the Korean state. They arrested the Minister of Agriculture, So Kwan-hee, and exposed him, quote unquote, as one of the authors of this plot. They claimed that he had been recruited by the United States all the way back during the Korean War. And he, along with a whole cadre of other people, of other North Korean bureaucrats, were arrested and executed shortly thereafter. North Korean propaganda then sought to link this struggle to survive the American starvation plot with Kim Il-sung's struggle against the Japanese. The phrase arduous march was actually a throwback to Kim Il-sung's one of his alleged heroic actions against Japan in the 1930s when he was an independence activist against Japan. Korean propagandists skillfully manipulated this famine, which was essentially man-made, into Korea's ongoing narrative of victimization at the hands of aggressive foreign nations, especially the United States. Understanding this history of victimization is necessary to understand how North Koreans view their leaders, and that is my second point, okay? Each of these periods of victimization provided an opportunity to legitimate and further establish the Kim regime. North Koreans are taught that it was Kim Il-sung who freed the Korean people from Japanese imperialism and then constructed a new social system dedicated to control by the people. It's really important to recognize that North Korea of the late 1940s and 1950s was not the North Korea of today. It was actually a comparatively wealthy society, and Kim Il-sung was immensely popular, partially because he was the first Korean successor after a hated Japanese regime, and partially because his communist revolution really seemed to place power in the hands of people who had been oppressed really for centuries, both under Japan and also as peasants in traditional Korea. It was his struggle against the Japanese and the North Korean Revolution that initially created the legitimacy of Kim Il-sung. And here you can see all three North Korean leaders together. So when this social system was then, quote unquote, attacked by the Americans during the Korean War, again, it was Kim Il-sung who saved the Korean people from foreign aggression, according to North Korean history. As we discussed, the war was terrible for North Koreans, but Kim Il-sung had an explanation for why they were suffering so horrifically. And that was Americans, quote, in their wild dreams of conquest, were determined to destroy North Korea at any cost. Blaming the conflict on the United States was essential because it allowed the Kim regime to claim victory when it fought the imperialist nations, the United States and the UN command, to a standstill. When I visited North Korea in 2010, I had an opportunity to visit the DMZ and talk to a North Korean general there who was explaining to me why the Korean War was a great victory for North Korea. And when I said, but it ended right where it started, how can you consider that a great victory? He simply said, we are still here. That was his explanation. North Koreans believe that the Korean War was an attempt to exterminate them as a people, which they survived, and survival was victory. Now, the post-war recovery after the Korean War further added to the legitimacy of Kim Il-sung. North Korea recovered from the war much faster than South Korea. And through the skillful use of propaganda then, Kim Il-sung was able to turn what was perhaps the greatest mistake of his life, launching the Korean War, into furthering the legitimacy of his regime. For about a decade after the war, the standard of living in North Korea would actually be higher than it was in South Korea. Finally, the arduous March period provided another opportunity for the Kim regime to reinforce itself in power. The famine of the arduous March was blamed on outside forces, as we discussed, and it was said that the United States was trying to take advantage of the situation now that Kim Il-sung was dead. This presented an opportunity for the next generation of the Kim regime, Kim Jong-il, to save his country through the augmentation of the military, the so-called military first policy, and to start a nuclear weapons program, which he said would provide for the long-term security of the Korean people against foreign aggression. Kim Jong-il proved to be as canny as his father at managing foreigners. He was able to wring maximum concessions out of the international community in several deals designed to limit or to get rid of his nuclear weapons program that he almost certainly had no intention of keeping. And that brings us to Kim Jong-un, who has furthered the Kim legacy by enhancing the DPRK's nuclear weapons arsenal, developing viable delivery systems for these weapons, and by making North Korea a nuclear power. In fact, North Korea is one of just a handful of nuclear powers in the world, something the Kim regime makes a big point of. Now, Kim Jong-un has also promised to bring economic development to North Korea, which he has not yet done. So I think his legacy is still very much unsettled. But certainly nuclear weapons are a big part of the legacy of Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un. So each of these periods of victimization serves to remind the Korean people that throughout their history and up to the present, they have been the victims of aggressive foreign nations, and that the only force standing between annihilation and themselves is the leadership of the Kim regime. They are taught that without this visionary leadership, their nation and indeed their very race would have been destroyed by the United States and other external enemies. And this brings me to my final point about North Korean ideology, and that is their views of themselves. So North Koreans view themselves as a uniquely homogenous or pure race that is in a daily struggle for its own survival. So scholars have noted that from the very beginning of Korean nationalism in the late 19th and early 20th century, that the sense of a Korean nation has been bound up in Korea's ethnic identity or the idea of a Korean race. In order to establish the distinctiveness of Koreans as compared to the Japanese and the Chinese, Korean historian and national theorist Shin Jae-ho fashioned a concept of a pure Korean bloodline passing from Korea's mythical founder Dangun down to the present. Now, numerous scholars have noted that this ethnic nationalism is one of the most powerful forces in Korean society, and it can really be seen as a source of pride in some contexts. It was an important factor in the failure of Japanese colonialism in Korea, that you simply could not force the Koreans to become Japanese. However, it can also be a source of prejudice and discrimination towards non-Koreans. And this is true in South Korea, but it is especially true in North Korea, where Korean ethno-nationalism has been nurtured over time into a pure Korean race ideology. Korean sociologist Ki Wook-shin has said that originally Korean nationalism was used to build a communist state in North Korea, whereas now it is simply used to perpetuate the Kim regime in power. The Kim regime does not cultivate the loyalty of North Koreans by explaining to them all of the material benefits of their rule or how much better their lives are now because of their visionary leadership. It cultivates their loyalty by convincing North Koreans from birth that there are external forces determined to destroy Koreans as a race, and that only single-minded unity behind the Kim regime will ensure their survival. Shifting the central purpose of the North Korean state from the construction of communism to the protection of the Korean race has been enormously beneficial for the Kim regime, because the regime can no longer successfully build a communist society, but it can guarantee the survival of the Korean race. This shift in purpose allows the Kim regime to claim that no matter how dire the situation is, even when Koreans are starving, as was happening in the 1990s, they can still claim victory because, after all, the Korean race continues to exist. They can tell their people, we are still here. Evidence of this extreme ethno-nationalism can be seen in the regime's propaganda, which routinely portrays non-Korean peoples not only as inferior, but sometimes as subhuman and showing unnatural cruelty, okay, as this image that I have on the screen now shows. And if you look at this image, you'll see it's not American soldiers who are doing these things to this poor Korean child. It's actually an American missionary and an American doctor. And this is an image taken right out of one of North Korea's most famous novels, Han Sorya's The Jackals, which was published in 1951 and still remains in print today. It can also be seen in the lengths the regime has gone to prevent miscegenation. So in 1963, all North Koreans in mixed marriages, which at that time was mainly with Soviet or Chinese citizens, were forced to divorce their partners or face internal exile. The North Korean government has also gone to great lengths to find non-Korean long-term sexual or romantic partners for the few long-term foreign residents of North Korea, including the four American soldiers who defected to North Korea after the Korean War, who now have all either returned or have passed away. Finally, and perhaps most shockingly, a UN Commission of Inquiry in 2014 found that North Korean women who were repatriated from China were given blood tests to determine if they were pregnant. And if they were found to be pregnant, they were forced to have abortions or to miscarry. And they were told that ethnically mixed children are not fit to live in North Korea, and what they had done was a crime against the Korean race. I hope you can see that these aspects of this ideology, their views of history, their views of their leaders, and their views of themselves are all interlocking. They reinforce one another to create what is truly a robust ideology. The history of victimization provides North Koreans with a sense of self-righteousness and a ready-made justification that no matter what we do, what has been done to us is worse. It also provides a foundation for the belief at the basis of their ethnonationalism that their race is truly under attack from outside forces, which in turn creates the demand for a strong, visionary, and decisive leadership that can only be met, at least to date, through the Kim regime. Now, I highly doubt that any of you who are watching this today would find the ideology that I have just outlined attractive, all right? But we need to understand that it is attractive to North Koreans in their current situation. First of all, this ideology gives them a sense of belonging and purpose. They are each participants in a struggle to defend their race. If they choose to believe it, this ideology gives meaning to their daily struggles and gives them a goal to strive for. It gives them a cause that is larger than themselves. It also gives North Koreans an explanation of why they live in such material deprivation compared to their neighbors, or even compared to the North Korea of several decades ago. The ideology I have laid out has an explanation for this and sends them the comforting message that it is not their fault, and it is not their leaders' fault, but it is the fault of aggressive foreigners that their lives have become so difficult. When we find ourselves in difficult circumstances, it's really only human nature to look for someone else to blame besides ourselves or those who we share strong social or familiar bonds with. North Koreans are no different, okay? Except that in North Korean society, there is no counter narrative. There is no dissenting voice to check this narrative and to challenge this narrative. A truly startling fact about North Korean defectors is that many of them have extreme difficulty adjusting to life outside of North Korea. Many defectors who make it to South Korea, where they are granted South Korean citizenship, find South Korean society alienating and life in South Korea completely meaningless, okay? They see it as unbelievably materialistic. And in the past decade, more than a dozen North Korean defectors to South Korea have actually redefected and returned to North Korea, all right? Now, that's a pretty small number, but at the same time, about 800 defectors have gone missing in the ROK. And although their whereabouts are unknown, many suspect that they have probably returned to North Korea. So there are many reasons why defectors would want to return, including the very strong desire of wanting to be reunited with their family and their community. However, even those defectors who escaped with their families to the South, such as Yeonmi Park, have acknowledged that the pull to return to North Korea is very strong. In a recent interview, Park said that even after years in South Korea, the temptation to return to North Korea would have been overwhelming if only she would have been guaranteed enough frozen potatoes to eat during the wintertime. Now, hopefully, I have laid out to you what I think are the salient features of North Korea's ideology. But I want to close this part of the lecture on ideology with an observation and a question. So first, the observation. I don't believe that North Koreans are brainwashed. And I also think that the idea or the concept of brainwashing is not helpful to understanding North Korea or North Koreans. I can't fully develop this observation here, but I believe that North Korean ideology functions much more like a religion. And like any religion, it doesn't provide all of the answers to life's persistent questions. But what it does offer is a benevolent authority figure in which North Koreans can place their faith, their hope, and their trust. This was the most shocking discovery that I feel like I made when I visited North Korea. The Koreans I spoke to, and of course it's a very, very small sample, but they didn't have answers to all my questions, and neither did they fully understand all of the policies that Kim Jong-il was pursuing at that time, but they had faith. They had a remarkable faith that Kim Jong-il had a plan and that all things would ultimately work out for good. It would work out to the benefit of North Korea in the long run if they were united behind him and if they had faith in him. If I am right that this ideology is more like a religion, then we need to abandon what I think is the very dangerous idea that North Koreans live in a very fragile ideological bubble that can be popped with the metaphorical needle of truth. For many North Koreans, I think their ideology is much more robust than that. And even if the Kim regime was to collapse tomorrow, the fallout of this ideology would take decades of re-education and confrontation with the past that, frankly, no human society on earth is very good at. That's my observation. The second is a question. My presentation invites, I think up to this point, a very important question. And that is, do all North Koreans really believe this? I mean, this is so extreme. Of course, this is a question that's impossible to answer with any certainty, right? We cannot poll North Koreans and ask them, what do you believe? What aspects of this ideology do you believe? But it also seems quite logical that some Koreans believe it, or else there would be no Korean regime. There would be no forced abortions. North Korea as we know it would not exist. On the other hand, if all North Koreans believed it, there would be no defectors. There would be no prison camps. There would be no need for such an extensive, oppressive apparatus. So this is somewhat painfully obvious, but I think the obvious answer is that some Koreans believe the regime's ideology, or at least most of it, and some do not, or they don't believe most of it. It would also seem a logical assumption that for those who do believe it, they are more likely to be concentrated in the core class at the top of Korean society, as it is far easier to believe in an ideological regime that benefits you over one that does not. And assuming that the core class is 20% of North Korea's population, this leaves a large body of potential non-believers in the two lower classes. So how are these Koreans controlled? Okay, and this will be the subject of the much shorter part of the second half of this lecture, and that is North Korea's use of underdevelopment. So before we can understand how North Korea uses underdevelopment, we just need to talk a little bit about the extent of the core class. The North Korean and Western focus on the Kim family often creates the illusion that they rule North Korea all by themselves. Okay. Now, the Kims are immensely powerful. They really are, but they do not rule Korea alone. Okay. Nor do they solely reap the benefits of the North Korean society they have created. They, in essence, share power and privilege with an entire ruling class of perhaps 3 to 5 million people. This is the core class. These are the soldiers, the police, the bureaucrats, the technocrats, the scientists that allow North Korea to survive. And although they are not wealthy by the world standards, they have immense wealth, privilege, and power by North Korean standards. Okay, it's members of this class that you will meet if you ever travel to North Korea, and they'll be probably the only Koreans you'll get to meet. Members of this class did not starve during the arduous march. Okay, they do not go without heat in the winter, and they do not go without food. All right, they maybe do not get all the food that they would want or all the varieties, but they are not the Koreans that starve to death. In the new black market economies of North Korea, some of the members of this core class can actually do quite well. All right. North Korea's golden couples of the last decade comprise a woman who has extensive dealings on the black market and a man whose party connections protects the family from crackdowns. This is so important because overthrowing the Kim regime would not just be a matter of overpowering a tiny clique at the very top of society, but of rooting out an entire class of people. This is the nature of power in North Korea. 20% of the population lives relatively well at the expense of 80%. All right. So how is that 80% controlled? Well, for the recalcitrant, there is repression. All right. It's estimated that the regime's prison camps hold between 500,000 and 200,000 prisoners. That's from Amnesty International. All right. So that's a sizable number, but it's still a small part of the population. For the average North Korean, those who are in the wavering class, their own poverty and North Korea's underdevelopment becomes a devastatingly effective means of control. And this is an image that I took into North Korea from across the border in China, where you can see people walking to do agricultural work from their village. You can see they're not even walking down a road. They're walking down a path where they have to cross a river that is unbridged. South Korean scholar and statistician Go Myung-hyun of the Asan Policy Institute, has put forth a hypothesis along these lines. So using satellite data, Go has suggested that urbanization levels in North Korea are much lower than North Koreans report, and perhaps as low as 25%. And that perhaps as much as 75% of the North Korean population lives in rural areas and works in agriculture. Now, agriculture in North Korea is unmechanized, it is highly inefficient, and it is back-breaking work. Worse, the state still attempts to collect all of the country's agricultural output to feed the core class without returning hardly any of it to the people, the farmers, who are actually doing the labor. And so North Korean agricultural laborers are expected to supplement their own food supply with subsistence gardening and through foraging for food. All the while they have to do their day job for the state. Now, the testimony of defectors from North Korea indicates that North Koreans have gotten very good at surviving under these circumstances, but it's also apparent that providing for their own survival in addition to working for the state takes up a great deal of their time. Time that might be spent in other societies on leisure activities or in organizing or at least thinking about the possibility of an alternative to the Kim regime. North Koreans outside of the core class, even if disgusted with the Kim regime, are likely too invested in their own struggle for survival to be interested in political activism. And if they're fed up with the regime, they're much more likely to try to leave than to try to make change. Their own poverty then becomes a devastatingly effective means of control. Now, somehow North Koreans, if there were some out there who were secure enough in their own survival to be interested in political change, they would have a very difficult time finding allies in this struggle, because North Koreans live lives of incredible isolation. North Korea's transportation and communication infrastructure is among the very worst in the world. In the entire country of North Korea, there are only 500 kilometers of paved roads. By comparison, in Dane County, Wisconsin, where I'm standing right now, there are 1,400 kilometers, and that's just in one county in Wisconsin. North Korean railways tell a similar story. Almost all their railways were built by Japan in the 1920s, 1930s, and have never been updated. Only 1% of their network uses electronic signaling system, meaning its carrying capacity is very, very low. It's very inefficient. All this means that it is very difficult to travel in North Korea. There is no legal inner city bus service in the entire country of North Korea. There are illegal city bus services, inner city bus services, but you have to pay extensive bribes to use them, and you have to have connections to be able to use them. So it's almost certainly that no one outside of the core class can use these types of service. There is no freedom of travel in North Korea. If the regime does not want you to travel, you do not travel, and by default, the regime does not want you to travel. The communication infrastructure is similar. North Korea has fewer than 5 telephone lines per 100 people. All right. There are several million cell phone subscribers in North Korea, but these are almost all concentrated in the core class. And as is cell networks in China, the system is very efficiently monitored. Access to the internet is so severely limited in North Korea that for most North Koreans, it might as well not exist. And even Koreans who do have access to the internet, it is really a North Korean intranet where they cannot get outside. North Koreans then, outside of the core class, are isolated in mainly rural communities without effective transportation or communication with other parts of the country, and frequently involved in a daily time-consuming struggle for their own survival. Given this reality, it's not difficult to understand why, despite the colossal mismanagement of North Korea, the Kim regime has not fallen victim to any popular uprisings. There's not even any evidence that one has ever been attempted. Those North Koreans, as I said, who find the regime intolerable are much more likely to try to leave. Since 1994 and really the collapse of communist North Korea, the regime has chosen to spend its resources on nuclear weapons, luxury items for the core class, and other projects that might bring hard currency into Korea. Now, this is one of the most iconic images of the Korean Peninsula, which I bet many of you have seen. You can see South Korea kind of on the right side of your screen. You can see northern China in the upper left of your screen. And in between, you see this dark spot, which is North Korea. And this image is often used to highlight the differences in development between North Korea and its neighbors. And it does that very well. But what is so shocking about this image is that North Korea is actually a net exporter of electricity. Every year, North Korea sells tens of millions of dollars of electricity, exports it to China, when only 1 in 4 North Koreans has access to any sort of electricity in their home. The regime has essentially abandoned the majority of its population, believing that they are too poor and too isolated to be much of any threat to the regime. This is how the regime uses underdevelopment as a means of control. So, in conclusion, I hope I've provided a framework for you to better understand North Korea. The use of ideology and underdevelopment has allowed the regime to become very efficient at cultivating the loyalty of those Koreans who are essential to the functioning of the state, repressing those who would undermine it, and keeping the rest of the country poor, isolated, and helpless. Using these methods, the Kim regime has ruled for decades, and there's no reason to think that it can't continue doing so for quite some time. I just want to conclude my talk today with 2 observations. All right. And first, there's a problem with everything that I have just told you. I have argued that North Korea is not communist. I have told you what it is, or I've tried to describe what it is, but I don't have a name for what this is. I don't know what you call this kind of state. What do you call such a regime? And I think this is the reason why the label communist continues to stick to North Korea, and you will continue to hear it in the news. We simply don't have a word for what North Korea is. In many ways, North Korea's political system and ideology is so unique that we don't even know how to categorize it. My second observation is that while I believe the North Korea is stable, its structure is neither robust nor flexible. The concentration of power, authority, and most important of all, legitimacy in the Kim family makes the regime very vulnerable, even if it's stable. Every succession is a potential crisis. And the fact that the regime has successfully navigated 2 is quite remarkable, but it's not a guarantee that they can continue to do so indefinitely. The premature death of Kim Jong-un, even a death from natural causes, would provoke a crisis of legitimacy in North Korea and likely a power struggle that could divide the core class and perhaps bring down the state as it currently exists. Now, the collapse of the Kim dynasty would certainly mean major changes in North Korea, but these changes might not be as drastic or in the direction that one would hope. It's quite conceivable that in the absence of the Kims, the core class could coalesce around a new leader or set of leaders that could utilize the existing ideology to a certain degree and the current underdevelopment of North Korea to perpetuate the misrule of North Korea long into the future. While the past is no guide to the future, it bears remembering that the Chosun dynasty, the last royal dynasty of traditional Korea, which many scholars have pointed out bears some resemblance to the Kim regime, lasted an astonishing 500 years despite extended periods of misrule. I think it's quite possible that North Korea will be with us in its current state for some time to come. Thank you very much for getting to speak to you today, and I look forward to addressing the questions that come in.
David, thank you so much. We are getting a lot of great questions, and you have brought up some amazing information here. I'd first of all like to ask you, are we looking at a 4th victimization with COVID? The country shut down its borders in January of 2020. There's some inkling that they may be preparing some sort of transition facility, some sort of decontamination facility to be able to bring in some imports from China. So I guess my question is, how do you think the COVID pandemic is affecting the country, the people, and the regime?
I think at this point, it's unlikely that this would be conceived of as a 4th victimization, although I think that's certainly possible. With regimes that have such tight control on information, they can really at least attempt to do some very drastic things. But the narrative that has come out of North Korea during COVID that the Kim regime has wanted to push is one of success. Officially, they have had 0 COVID cases in North Korea. Now, I don't know anyone who takes that seriously. Almost certainly they have had some COVID cases, but they have completely sealed their borders in a way that almost only North Korea could. And so it's possible that they have been able, that they might have weathered the COVID crisis better than some countries. It could have been very bad, quite frankly, since their health system is in such a state of decrepitude, and since no one knows even in fact how many North Koreans there are. It's possible that tens of thousands of North Koreans could die and maybe no one would even know the difference. But the narrative certainly coming out of the regime has been, we have handled this crisis very well. We have been successful. We have kept COVID out of the country. I think the whole example, though, of North Korea sealing its borders during COVID really shows us a valuable lesson. And that is that sanctions on North Korea, while I think most of them are necessary, and in fact, I support them, they are not probably going to result in changes in North Korean behavior. Because by cutting off their economy, actually, the North Koreans essentially impose sanctions on themselves that are so much worse than anything the United States or the international community could have done to North Korea. And yet their economy has continued to chug along. And I don't think it's been particularly good for North Koreans, but all the economic indicators are that it hasn't really been that terrible either. It's kind of just gone along the way it has been for the last decade or so. And I think that's a result of the North Korean state essentially being structured in such a way to support the top 20% of society, those North Koreans who are essential to the functioning of the state. And they can always provide for that level. They can always provide for that number of people. They can always make sure that number of people is fed and housed and at least has their energy needs met. So I do support sanctions against North Korea. I think they're necessary, but I think we also have to be wide-eyed about what they're actually going to accomplish.
Yeah, there was a great piece in the Washington Post today that made that very argument that their closing of their border was the most dramatic sanction that they could put on themselves. We're getting a lot of really good questions, David. I'm going to ask you a couple from the audience here. What are some steps do you think the U.S. should or could take to improve relations between the two countries?
That's an interesting question, because if only wanting to improve relations is the goal, we could normalize relations with North Korea tomorrow. North Korea would be more than happy to have quote unquote normal relations in the United States, where we open an embassy in Pyongyang and they open an embassy in Washington. They would be more than happy to accept that legitimacy. Because one thing that North Korea really wants, and this is my perspective on it, is they want to be recognized as a full member of the international community, and they want all the benefits that that community gives while not following a lot of the key rules of that community. Okay, so North Korea has violated the rules of this community in regard to international finance in the 1970s through various terrorist activities, including blowing up civilian airliners in the late 1980s, including developing nuclear weapons outside of the NPT, which they joined in the late 1980s and then left in the late 1990s. So North Korea would love to get back into the community of nations on equal terms without ever having to make amends or without ever having to change its behavior. So, I mean, if the goal was to have normal relations with North Korea, we could have that immediately. I happen to think that that's not actually what we want. That North Korean behavior is a serious challenge, not just to the United States or even primarily to the United States, but really to a rules-based international order. And I think that North Korea needs to be known that we can't necessarily stop you from doing these sorts of behaviors, but we can keep the costs of those behaviors high, that you can't be a part of the international community of states and engage in this kind of activity. I would also just like to add that one thing that always makes me nervous is when I see the threat of North Korea being portrayed as primarily a bilateral issue between North Korea and the United States. And this was a major criticism that I had of what President Donald Trump attempted. I don't think North Korea is a problem that the United States should or wants to own, right? We do not want to be trying to solve the North Korean issue all by ourselves. I don't think we can, on the one hand. And so when you have a problem that's so big and so intractable that there's no obvious solutions, what do? You don't want to take ownership of it. You want to make allies. You want to build consensus and try to find a solution in the long term and make sure that the burden and the responsibility of sharing this of solving this is shared across as many of your partners as possible.
Do you think China could be one of those allies? I know, obviously, we just had a conversation between the leaders of our countries recently, yesterday. Do you think that's even in the possibility, or are we talking about a broader Asian, kind of coalition?
I think it should be as broad as possible. There was the 6-party talks. I think that framework was good, but a lot of the sanctions that are on North Korea now come from the UN, and they've almost all been unanimous. I mean, there's a lot of consensus on North Korea's behavior, and we're not only talking about nuclear weapons, we're talking human rights abuses as being completely unacceptable. I think it would be much better if the United States would take a step back and say, we're not going to engage on talks with North Korea one-on-one because we are not the owners of this problem. This is the international community. North Korea is violating the standards of the international community, and let North Korea know that they're not going to be able to salami slice and pick off states one by one, that they're going to face a united front in this sense. In your question about China, I think it's a really important question, and you'll often hear American policymakers say, China needs to do more, and they'll portray China as the key to pressuring North Korea. Now, on the one hand, there's a reason that you do that, and China has incredible leverage over North Korea. Most of the connectivity that North Korea has with the rest of the world goes through China. Whether we're talking coal or electricity or the internet or different types of communications infrastructure. So China does have serious leverage. What most people miss, and it's such an important point, is that northern China around North Korea is what's called the Yanbian Korean Autonomous Region. And historically, it was majority ethnic Korean. Now, it's not majority ethnic Korean anymore, but there is still a large population of ethnic Koreans in that region. And if you know much about China, China has, I believe it's either 56 or 58 official ethnic minorities. And some of them we hear a lot about, such as the Uyghurs or the Tibetans. Some of them you don't, such as the Koreans. But from the Chinese state's perspective, the ethnic Koreans in China have been almost a model minority, according to the Chinese system. They haven't caused a lot of trouble. So the last thing that China wants to see is a collapse of North Korea that would send millions of radically nationalist Koreans crossing the border into northern China, because you cannot cross the DMZ into South Korea. It's almost impossible. Whereas the border between North Korea and China is actually quite porous, which is how most defectors escape that way. So the last thing the Chinese want to see is millions of rabidly nationalist North Korea crossing into China and settling in that part of northern China that already has a very large Korean population. So while China has immense leverage on North Korea, I like to think of it as they have one button they can push. They can squeeze North Korea, and maybe North Korea will collapse, but that's not in their interest anyway. So they don't have fine-grained leverage. They can't tell Kim Jong-un not to do this, not to do that. They could cut off, coal exports the next day, but that is not in their interest to do so. So I think it's important to work with China, but I think it's also important to be honest about the limitations on what China can do.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, absolutely. I have a question, a little different path here. One of our viewers is asking if you could please say something about Kim's youth group programs.
Kim's youth group programs. I have to say, if they are talking about the Young Pioneers, that is the only North Korean youth group program that I know of. I believe that long predates Kim Jong-un. I think that goes all the way back to the 1960s. I do not, if they're referencing the Young Pioneers, I don't know a lot about those sort of organizations, but I know that like most aspects of North Korean society, even youth society in North Korea is very highly organized and highly regimented. And I believe, as far as the Young Pioneers go, you don't really have a choice whether you're a part of it or not. It's something that you have to enroll in as a child, and it's part of the state's process of imparting the proper ideology in North Korean. So this happens in schools. This happens in these other kind of groups as well. I'm not terribly knowledgeable about that, though.
Gotcha. A question from Karen, wondering what are North Korea's views of South Koreans? You touched on this a little bit in terms of when someone defects to South Korea, but how do they see their neighbors? Yeah, maybe you could just delve into that a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think there's kind of a bifurcation of views in the way North Koreans would view the South Korean leadership and South Korean society, and then maybe the South Korean people more generally. So the view of South Korea generally from North Korea is that South Korea is actually a puppet of the United States. It's essentially an American colony. As you know, you probably know, there are 28,000 U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. We have a very large military presence there. South Korea is an alliance of the United States. So the North Koreans look at this apparatus and like to portray South Korea as just a puppet of the United States. However, the way they think of South Koreans and the way South Koreans think of North Koreans is very fascinating, and it's quite different. And they see them primarily through a lens of ethnic kin, okay, of people who share the same race, the same language, and the same culture. And this has really interesting implications, actually, for the US South Korean alliance, because most South Koreans do not necessarily see North Korea as a threat the way Americans see North Korea as a threat. They know that North Korea is dangerous, okay? They know that North Korea started the Korean War. They know North Korean nuclear weapons are not a good thing. But at the same time, there is a strong sense of kinship and ethnic identity with them. And I like to explain it. I like to attempt to explain it like this. Imagine 50 years ago, Wisconsin was divided in half right down the I-39 corridor. And I'm from La Crosse, and, the rest of my family is from Green Bay. And now 70 years later, imagine, somehow we'd fought a war, all these terrible things had happened. But at the end of the day, we're still all Wisconsinites. We still speak with this silly accent. We still love the Packers. We still all eat cheese. And even though, we know that they're dangerous, we also know that they're our family and we're connected to them in some way. And added to that, the fact that, Koreans didn't divide themselves. The division of Korea was something that was imposed on the Korean Peninsula by the United States and the Soviet Union. It wasn't a Korean idea. That adds to this sense that North Korea is something more to be pitied than it is to be feared from the South Korean perspective. And I think from the North Korean perspective, it's almost similar towards South Korea. It's more to be pitied that these people cannot have their independence from the United States. And in fact, North Korea, as a part of the long-term goals of the Kim regime, and this is from Kim Il-sung down to Kim Jong-un, has been the reunification of the Korean Peninsula, the liberation of South Korea from the United States to reunite the Korean Peninsula. So I think there's actually similar dynamics both ways.
Trevor has a question that kind of follows up on this theme, in that if someone defects from North Korea to the South, but decides to return, is the regime forgiving of their defection? How are they treated? What happens to those folks in general?
For most of them, we don't know. There have been a few cases of really high-profile defectors that have been treated quite well, at least initially, because the propaganda value of that is just astronomical to the North Koreans. Someone left the fatherland. They spent a few years living in decadent, capitalist South Korea, and they couldn't have it anymore, and then they came back. So they're likely to be paraded on national television, to say things about how happy they are to be home. What happens to them after that, I feel like it's probably really hard to say, and it's probably highly dependent on the individual and whether the regime feels like there is still some utility in, having this individual restored to society, or whether they feel like they're a threat to society. I have a feeling it really depends. Again, the sample size is so small. There's only been, in the last decade, 12 officially recognized redefectors. Although most scholars think that the number is certainly higher than that, but nobody really knows.
So, Trevor, who asked us this question, has a follow-up, and he's wondering if you've ever spoken to anyone who has defected. So I'm guessing probably not with these small numbers that we've.
I actually have.
Oh.
I've spoken with. I guess only one. When I lived in Korea, no, I've had several meetings with one particular individual. I guess I actually have been in rooms where I met with many more.
Sure.
But the last time I lived in South Korea, I volunteered with an organization that tries to help defectors reacclimate and possibly make a transition to the United States for a university education. So I met for several months with a defector, mainly as an English tutor, and helping this person with their entrance applications to universities. They wanted to go to university in the United States. So I did get to meet this person, but we were instructed, and I think this was good, that we did not talk about their past in North Korea. If they brought it up, that would have been fine, but I was told not to ask questions about it. And frankly, I was more than comfortable with that relationship, with that restriction. I was not going into this organization as a scholar. I was going into this organization as just an individual who wanted to do anything that was possible to aid some of these people. So I ended up having, a very nice relationship with this person. I think that they were working very hard to try to come to terms with their past in North Korea and to try to plot a different future for themselves. But yeah, we did not talk at all about their family situation. But it is true, when a defector leaves, as far as we know, there are almost always repercussions for their families. I don't think usually their families would suffer execution, but it usually involves some time in a labor camp or a re-education camp. And it's something that defectors, any defectors who have written books, you'll read about them having to deal with this, the guilt, if they were not able to get their families out, of knowing surely what had happened to them after they left.
Yeah. Heavy weight on their shoulders. Question from Mark: how much pressure can China put on North Korea to divest from nuclear weapons?
I don't think they can. I actually think that China has almost certainly told North Korea, we don't want you to do this. North Korean nuclear weapons are not in China's interest. Now, the Chinese perspective on that may vary from time to time, but I don't see what China would get out of North Korea's nuclear weapons. And they certainly do not enjoy the tensions when they get out of control between the U.S. and North Korea. But they cannot force North Korea to abandon its nuclear weapons programs. I mean, what they could do is they could cut off coal exports to North Korea. They could cut off electricity to North Korea. They could cut off the internet to North Korea. And the regime would probably still survive. Or if it didn't survive, it might collapse. But it's probably not going to moderate its position. I think North Korea is absolutely committed to having nuclear weapons, and they're not going to give up. It checks so many boxes for them. I mean, not only the security box, but it also checks the box of, this is one of the few accomplishments that the Kim regime can point to. What have they done over the last 70 years? They've not enhanced the livelihoods of the Korean people, but they have developed nuclear weapons, which very few other states have done. Now, the truth is there's a lot of states that could develop nuclear weapons. They just choose not to. Well, North Korea has chosen to do it and to really trumpet it. And then finally, North Korean nuclear weapons gives them serious leverage, I don't think immediately, but in the long term, towards actually reuniting the Korean Peninsula. And I think that is a goal of the North Korean regime in the long term. And they will have many more options on the table if they're a nuclear weapons state rather than if they're not. And I don't think there's anything the international community can promise them or give them that are as valuable as nuclear weapons in accomplishing all these goals.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, there's really no turning back.
I don't think so.
Yeah. Question from John: when was Korea first divided ideologically into North and South Korea? Was it during the Japanese occupation or prior to that?
So this is a really, really good question and a really deep question. I'm actually writing my second book right now on the post-liberation period, so 1945 to 1950, basically the point from when the line was drawn to when the two states are created. So it's actually a question that I'm dealing with right now. And I tend to think that the ideological division actually really happens after the creation of the two states. And the ideological division that we see today is the product of really decades of differing types of education, differing types of ideology in North Korea and South Korea. I tend to, you will often see scholarship that traces Korean communism all the way back to the 1930s, and then traces the lineage of Syngman Rhee, who I wrote my first book about, for lack of a better term, we'll say capitalist leader of South Korea, back to the United States in the 1920s. And so they'll try to say that this ideological division was a long time in coming. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think in 1945, what you have is all Koreans are in fact left of center when it comes to economics, when it comes to the role of government in societies. There was no real division between the capitalist side and the communist side. What they really were divided over was whether Korea should have its independence immediately or whether it should get it at the end of 5 years via a trusteeship arrangement with the Soviet Union and United States. And by and large, the communists were in favor of the trusteeship agreement. the non-communists, I hate to call them capitalists because that's not really what this is about, the non-communists were opposed to that agreement. So that was the initial ideological divide. But had the Korean War gone either way, that is, united under North Korea or united under South Korea, ideologically, the Koreans at that point would not have been that far apart, I don't think. It's really taken time to get them this far apart. That's a great question.
Yeah. A question from Stephanie, and I think you addressed this a little bit before, but what can President Biden and his administration in particular do for the relationship with North Korea? What do you think their strategy should be?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think walking back the Trump strategy is a good strategy. For the reasons I said before, I don't think we want to own this issue. I don't think North Korean nuclear weapons or any aspect of North Korea is really primarily a bilateral issue between North Korea and the United States. I think we want to widen the lens on this as much as possible, not because I think that's actually going to lead to a solution. I'm not sure that there is a solution right now, but at least the United States will not bear all the responsibility then for not finding a solution. However, Todd, I do want to walk back just a little bit, something that I think I might have implied earlier when I said North Korea is never going to give up its nuclear weapons. I don't think that they will, but I think North Korea might be open to some sort of arms control deal that in the long term might be in the best interest of the international community and North Korea. I don't think the current Kim regime is there yet. I don't think they're there at all, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't be in the future, or that doesn't mean a future North Korean leader wouldn't be there. So I think one of the most difficult challenges of deciding how you're going to deal with North Korea is how do you toe the line as to what you think is absolutely necessary for the United States national interests or in the interest of the international community. But then how do you also know when a North Korean leader might be willing to negotiate in good faith and actually make a deal? All right. Because I think telling the difference between the two could be very, very tricky. And so one of the things that I'd like to think through this myself, if I was a policymaker, what would I see in North Korea that would make me think, oh, something is actually changing now? And one of the things that I would like to see is roads being built in North Korea. As I said, there are 500 kilometers of paved roads in the entire country of North Korea. If North Korea is serious, if Kim Jong-un is serious about economic development, there are steps he could take tomorrow to unleash unbelievable economic development in his country without any changes in the international sanctions regime, without any influx of foreign capital. So I would like to see those kinds of changes happening in North Korea first. Roads being built, railways being modernized, Koreans having some freedom to move internally. And that for me would be the first sense that, okay, North Koreans might be serious now about economic development. And that might be an inroad. That might be a way to reach some sort of durable arms control arrangement. Probably not getting rid of all their nuclear weapons, but maybe doing something that can at least maintain the status quo a while longer.
Yeah, it would certainly be a legacy moment for Kim Jong-un, who looks for those kind of events and big projects to kind of stamp his seal. So I guess really kind of leads to our last question, which is what do you see is the future for North Korea? And is it just completely tied to Kim Jong-un and his regime? Will nothing change until he is gone somehow, some way, either through poor health, which is of course always a rumored situation, or some other something else that happens to him? What is the future for North Korea?
You know,
do you have your crystal ball? That
I have no idea. If I knew that, I'd probably be in another line of work. But I think one thing that we can prepare for is I think there's two scenarios that are quite likely, and that is the perpetuation of the current regime for the foreseeable future. I mean, Kim Jong-un is a rather young individual. He is not the healthiest of individuals, but that can always change. And there's no reason to think at this moment why he would be unable to rule North Korea for 30 or 40 more years. I mean, North Korea has already gone through so many terrible periods and has not shown the slightest inklings of instability. So I think it's quite possible that, you know, I'll live the rest of my career and die with a Kim still ruling North Korea. On the other hand, as I said, North Korea is the structure is stable, but it's not robust and it's not flexible. So I like to think of North Korea as a massive tower made of iron. Okay, it's very strong, but it's not very flexible. So the right kind of vibrations, the right kind of shocks, and it can't sway, it'll crack and it'll all come down. So I think the most likely scenarios for North Korea in the future are the least desirable ones, either the perpetuation of this regime for decades or a sudden collapse. And that's not what anybody wants. I mean, ideally in North Korea, what you would have is you would have a slow evolution towards a more developmental, more liberal society that eventually, over decades, could be reunited with South Korea. And the terrible damage that's been done to the Korean Peninsula could be undone. However, I don't really see, I see much less inklings right now that is possible than either a long rule of Kim Jong-un or a sudden collapse of the regime.
Well, David, thank you so much. This has been just a fascinating presentation, and I just cannot tell you how much we thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Agree. Really, really fascinating information, David. Thank you so much for sharing. And on behalf of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, thank you to David for the wonderful talk and Todd for helping to moderate a wonderful discussion with our alumni and viewers today. And thank you to all of our viewers for joining us. We hope you enjoyed your time with us. We also hope that you'll join us for our upcoming Wisconsin Ideas Spotlight program, Fighting Disease with Gene Therapy, on December 9th at 11 a.m. To learn more about this program, please visit our website, uwalumni.com, and we'll also drop a link in the chat for more information. Thanks again to all of you for joining us today. Be well, and on Wisconsin.
On Wisconsin.